Gen Alpha gets called brain-rotted. Gen Z gets called too sensitive. And millennials? Still being called lazy, even though they're in their 30s running companies. But here's what nobody stops to think about. The same people calling Gen Alpha brain-rotted were called lazy by someone else. The same people calling Gen Z sensitive never learned to talk about their own emotions. So maybe the problem isn't the generation. Maybe the problem is that we've never actually tried to understand why each generation thinks differently, feels differently, and reacts differently. Today we're going to change that. Pure psychology. No labels. No judgment. Just the truth about what shaped each generation's mind. See, we grow up thinking that the way we see the world is just the way the world is. But that's not how psychology works. Every single behavior you have, every reaction, every habit, every way you cope with stress or deal with failure, it wasn't random. It was built. Psychologists call this generational conditioning. It means the environment you grew up in literally rewired how your brain processes the world. A millennial who grew up watching their parents lose jobs in a recession didn't choose to become anxious about money. Their brain learned that survival requires hustle. A Gen Z kid who grew up seeing school shootings on the news every other week didn't choose to become hyper-aware of danger. Their brain learned that the world isn't always safe. A Gen Alpha child growing up with a screen in their hand from age 2 didn't choose to have a shorter attention span. Their brain learned to expect constant stimulation. None of them chose this. Their world chose it for them. So before we compare, we need to understand. Because you can't judge a fish for not being able to climb a tree. Each generation was swimming in a completely different ocean. Now here's what we're actually going to do today. We're not going to talk about which generation had it harder. We're not going to talk about who's stronger, who's weaker, or who's more entitled. We're going to look at 5 specific behaviors. 5 areas where millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha respond completely differently. And for each one, we're going to ask the same question. First, how each generation handles stress. Because the way you cope when life gets hard says everything about how your brain was trained. Second, how each generation processes information. Because the way you consume the world around you shapes how you think, decide, and act. Third, how each generation builds relationships. Because connection looks completely different depending on the world you grew up in. Fourth, how each generation responds to failure. Because what you do when you fall reveals more about your psychology than anything else. And fifth, how each generation sees their own future. Because hope, fear, and ambition don't look the same across generations. 5 behaviors. 3 generations. 0 judgment. And by the end of this, you might just understand yourself a little better too. Let's get into it. Category 1. How each generation handles stress. And I want you to think about this honestly. When life gets overwhelming, when work is too much, relationships are too complicated, and everything feels like it's pressing down on you at once, what do you actually do? Because the answer to that question is one of the most revealing things about your psychology. Let's start with millennials. Millennials grew up watching their parents work themselves to the bone. No complaints. No therapy. No talking about feelings. Just push through. So when stress hits a millennial, their brain does exactly what it was trained to do. Suppress it. And work harder. Psychologists call this an avoidant coping mechanism. It means instead of processing the stress, they bury it under productivity. More work. More hustle. More achievement. And it works until it doesn't. Because you can only bury things for so long before they come back up. That's why millennials are the generation that normalized the word burnout. They didn't burn out because they were weak. They burned out because nobody ever taught them that rest was allowed. Now Gen Z. Gen Z grew up in a completely different environment. They had social media. They had online communities. They had access to mental health conversations from a very young age. So when stress hits a Gen Z, their brain does something millennials were never taught to do. They talk about it. Post about it. Text a friend. Find a community that gets it. Psychologists call this an expressive coping mechanism. It means instead of suppressing the stress, they externalize it. Get it out. Process it out loud. Feel validated. And that's actually healthier than what millennials were doing. But it comes with its own problem. Sometimes the expression becomes the habit, and the actual problem never gets solved. And then there's Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha is growing up in a world of infinite content. Shorts, films, reels, streams. There is always something to watch. Always something to click on. Always something to pull their attention away from whatever they're feeling. So when stress hits a Gen Alpha, their brain does what it was trained to do from day one. Not because they're weak, not because they don't care, but because their brain learned very early that discomfort can be replaced instantly. Psychologists call this an escapist coping mechanism. And the scary part? The escape works, at least for a while, which makes it very hard to stop. And here's the honest truth about all three. Avoidance, expression. None of them are perfect. None of them are completely wrong either. They're just three different answers to the same very human question. How do I get through this? Next category. How each generation processes information. And this one's fascinating because it's not about intelligence. It's about how your brain learned to consume the world around you. Let's start with millennials again. Millennials grew up in the Google era. You had a question? You searched for it. You found an article. You read the whole thing. Their brain learned to process information linearly. Start at the beginning. Read to the end. Absorb it deeply. That's why millennials are really good at deep dives. Give them a topic, and they'll research it for hours. Read multiple sources. Fact-check everything. But here's the thing. That takes time. And the world doesn't always give you time anymore. Now Gen Z. Gen Z didn't grow up with Google. They grew up with TikTok, Instagram, Twitter threads. Information didn't come in articles anymore. It came in bursts. So their brain adapted. Gen Z processes information in parallel. That means they can scan 5 different sources at once, pull the key points, and move on. They're not reading less. They're reading wider. And honestly, that's a skill. In a world with infinite information, knowing how to filter fast is powerful. But it comes with a trade-off. Sometimes the depth gets lost. You know a little about everything, but not a lot about anything. And then there's Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha is growing up in the age of YouTube Shorts, Reels, AI-generated summaries. They don't even have to search anymore. The algorithm just gives it to them. So their brain is developing what psychologists call hyperselective attention. It means their brain has learned to decide in seconds, is this worth my time or not? If it's not instantly engaging, if it's not visually stimulating, if it's not already optimized for their attention span. And people call this brain rot. But here's what they're missing. Gen Alpha's brain isn't damaged. It's evolved for the environment they're in. Put a millennial in 2010. They thrive. Put that same millennial in 2024 with Gen Alpha's content speed. They'd struggle too. It's not the generation. It's the environment. In a world where there are 10 million things competing for your attention every second, being able to filter instantly is actually an adaptation. The problem isn't that Gen Alpha can't focus. The problem is we're asking them to focus in ways their brain was never trained to. 3 generations. Linear, parallel, hyper-selective. None of them are smarter or dumber than the other. They're just 3 different operating systems running on the same hardware. Now let's talk about relationships. And I don't just mean romantic relationships. I mean, how do you connect with people? How do you build trust? How do you maintain friendships? Because the way you relate to others says everything about the world you grew up in. Let's start with millennials. Millennials grew up in the early internet era. You had MySpace, then Facebook, MSN Messenger. But here's the key thing about those platforms. They were extensions of your real life. You connected with people you already knew. Your classmates, your neighbors, your actual friends. Online was just another way to stay in touch. So millennials built relationships through what psychologists call community-based bonding. That means their friendships are rooted in shared history. You met in middle school. You went through stuff together. You stayed close. And there's something beautiful about that. Millennials have these tight-knit circles, people they've known for 10, 15, 20 years. But it also means, if you're not in the circle, it's hard to get in. Because their friendships are built on time. And you can't fast-forward time. Now Gen Z. Gen Z grew up in a completely different online world. Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, Discord. These platforms weren't just for people you already knew. They were for finding your people. So Gen Z builds relationships differently. They use what's called selective attachment. That means they connect based on shared interests, shared values, shared identity. Not just shared geography. You could be in New York. Your best friend could be in London. Doesn't matter. You found each other online, and the connection is real. But here's the trade-off. Gen Z also normalized something millennials didn't. Ghosting. Situationships. Setting boundaries without explanation. And older generations see that as cold. But it's not cold. It's protective. Because when you have access to thousands of people online, you have to filter fast. You can't invest in everyone. You'd burn out. So Gen Z learned to protect their energy by being selective, even if it looks harsh from the outside. And then there's Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha is growing up in the age of content creators, streamers, YouTubers. And here's what's fascinating. For a lot of Gen Alpha kids, their closest relationships aren't with people they can touch. They're with people they watch. They know their favorite YouTuber's personality better than some of their classmates. They feel connected to streamers who don't even know they exist. Psychologists call this parasocial bonding. And before you dismiss it as fake or unhealthy, understand this. To Gen Alpha, these relationships feel real. Because in their world, connection has always been digital. They've never known a version of friendship that required physical presence. So when they feel close to someone they've never met, it's not because they're confused. It's because their brain learned a different definition of closeness. Is it ideal? Maybe not. Is it unhealthy? Not necessarily. It's just different. And different doesn't mean broken. 3 generations. Community-based. Selective. Parasocial. None of them became less social. They just redefined what social means. Now before we get into the next 2 categories, which honestly hit the hardest, if this is making you see these generations differently, do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into human psychology regularly at the Thinking Brain. Not surface-level stuff. Real psychology. Real behavior. Real insights. And if you're finding this valuable, hit the like button too. It genuinely helps. Alright, let's keep going. Alright. Category 4. How each generation responds to failure. And this one's heavy. Because the way you react when things fall apart reveals more about your psychology than almost anything else. Let's start with millennials. Millennials grew up being told, if you work hard enough, you'll succeed. Study hard. Get good grades. Go to college. Get a good job. The formula was clear. So when a millennial fails, their brain doesn't blame the system. It blames them. Psychologists call this an internal locus of control. It means when something goes wrong, they look inward. I didn't work hard enough. I wasn't good enough. I should have done more. And on one hand, that creates resilience. Millennials are really good at pushing through obstacles, at trying again, at grinding harder. But on the other hand, it creates guilt. Because when the world doesn't reward your effort, and your brain keeps telling you it's your fault, you start to believe you're the problem, even when you're not. Now Gen Z. Gen Z grew up watching millennials burn out. They saw people work themselves to exhaustion and still struggle to afford rent. So when Gen Z fails, they don't just blame themselves. They look at the system too. Psychologists call this a mixed locus of control. It means they ask, was this actually my fault? Or is the game rigged? And that's not making excuses. That's critical thinking. Gen Z is the generation that questions things. Why do I need a degree that puts me in debt? Why do entry-level jobs require 5 years of experience? Why does hard work not guarantee stability anymore? And because they're willing to challenge the system, they're also willing to walk away from it. Quit the job that's toxic. Drop out of the major that doesn't serve them. Set boundaries even if it disappoints people. Older generations see that as quitting, but Gen Z sees it as self-preservation. And then there's Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha is growing up in a world where failure is instant. You lose in a game? Restart. Video doesn't perform well? Delete it. Post another one. Something doesn't work? Try again immediately. So their brain is developing what psychologists call iterative resilience. That means they don't attach heavy emotions to failure. It's just data. That didn't work. Next attempt. No shame. No spiral. No existential crisis. Just reset. And in a fast-moving world, that's actually an advantage. But here's the concern. When failure doesn't sting, do you learn from it the same way? Millennials feel failure deeply. Sometimes too deeply. Gen Z questions failure. Sometimes to the point of paralysis. Gen Alpha resets from failure. Sometimes before processing what went wrong. 3 generations. 3 completely different relationships with the same human experience. None of them are doing it wrong. They're just doing it differently. And finally, how each generation sees their own future. And this one might be the most telling of all. Because how you see tomorrow shapes how you live today. Let's start with millennials. Millennials grew up optimistic. They were told they could be anything, do anything, achieve anything. The world was full of possibility, and they believed it. So psychologically, millennials developed what's called a deferred gratification mindset. That means they were willing to sacrifice now for rewards later. Study hard now. You'll get the job later. Work long hours now. You'll get promoted later. Save money now. You'll buy a house later. The future was the goal. And everything they did was building toward it. But then, the future didn't deliver. Jobs didn't pay enough. Houses became unaffordable. Promotions didn't come. And now millennials are stuck in this weird psychological space, where they still believe in working toward the future, but they're also anxious that the future will disappoint them again. Now Gen Z didn't grow up with that same optimism. They grew up seeing climate change reports, economic crashes, pandemics, political chaos. So when you ask Gen Z about their future, they're realistic. Sometimes painfully realistic. Psychologists call this anticipatory anxiety. It means they expect things to go wrong, not because they're pessimistic by nature, but because their lived experience taught them that instability is normal. So Gen Z plans differently. They don't defer gratification the way millennials did. They live now. Travel while you can. Enjoy experiences. Don't wait for some perfect future that might never come. And older generations see that as reckless. But Gen Z sees it as smart. Because if the future is uncertain anyway, why sacrifice the present for it? And then there's Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha is growing up in pure chaos. Climate anxiety. AI taking jobs. Inflation. They were born into uncertainty. So they don't have the optimism millennials had. And they don't have the anxious realism Gen Z has either. What they have is something psychologists are calling fluid future orientation. It means they don't have a fixed idea of what their future will look like. Because in their world, everything changes too fast to plan that far ahead. So instead of planning for one specific future, they're learning to adapt to whatever comes. No rigid career path. No single life plan. Just flexibility. And that might sound unstable. But in a world that's constantly shifting, adaptability might be the most valuable skill you can have. 3 generations. Optimistic but anxious. Realistic but present-focused. Uncertain but adaptable. None of them see the future clearly, but each one is doing their best to prepare for it. Now here's what nobody talks about. Every generation looks at the next one and thinks they're doing it wrong. Boomers looked at millennials and said, they're lazy. They don't want to work. Millennials look at Gen Z and say, they're too sensitive. They can't handle criticism. Gen Z looks at Gen Alpha and says, they're brain-rotted. They can't focus on anything. But here's the thing. Single generation has said this about the one after them. Socrates, in ancient Greece, literally complained that young people were disrespectful and lazy. That was over 2,000 years ago. And guess what? Those disrespectful, lazy young people he complained about? They became Plato, Aristotle, the foundation of Western philosophy. They turned out fine. And every single generation since then turned out fine. They built societies. They raised families. They solved problems. They adapted. So maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't the generation. Maybe the problem is our resistance to change. Because it's easier to blame the next generation for being different than it is to accept that the world they're growing up in isn't the world we grew up in. And it never will be again. Now let's be honest for a second. Every generation has strengths. And every generation has blind spots. Millennials built resilience through hardship. They learned to push through when things got hard. To keep going even when the system didn't support them. But sometimes, that resilience turns into burnout. Because they never learned when to stop. Gen Z built emotional intelligence through open conversation. They normalized talking about mental health, setting boundaries, asking for help. But sometimes, the conversation becomes the escape. And the problem never actually gets solved. Gen Alpha is building adaptability through constant change. They're learning to pivot fast, to handle uncertainty, to filter information at lightning speed. But sometimes, the speed means they miss the depth. They move on before fully understanding what they just experienced. So the question isn't, which generation is better? The question is, what can each generation learn from the other? Millennials could learn from Gen Z's emotional awareness. Gen Z could learn from Millennials' long-term focus. Gen Alpha could learn from both, how to balance speed with depth. And all three could stop judging each other for adapting to the world they were given. Because none of them chose the environment they grew up in. They're just doing what humans have always done. Surviving it. So let's bring it all back. Stress response. Information processing. Relationships. Failure. Future. 5 behaviors. 3 generations. Completely different approaches. But all shaped by one thing. The world they grew up in. Millennials learned to suppress and push through, because that's what survival looked like in their world. Gen Z learned to express and question, because that's what survival looks like in theirs. Gen Alpha is learning to adapt and filter, because that's what survival looks like in a world moving faster than any generation before them has ever experienced. And none of them are wrong. They're just different. Now here's what I want you to think about. Which behavioral pattern do you see in yourself? Do you suppress stress and overwork, like a millennial? Do you process everything out loud and set hard boundaries, like Gen Z? Do you scroll to escape and reset quickly from failure, like Gen Alpha? And here's the more important question. Is that pattern serving you? Or is it limiting you? Because psychology isn't about labeling yourself and stopping there. It's about understanding yourself so you can grow. If you're a millennial burning out, maybe it's time to learn boundaries from Gen Z. If you're Gen Z stuck in analysis paralysis, maybe it's time to borrow some of that millennial grit. If you're Gen Alpha moving too fast to process, maybe slowing down isn't weak. Maybe it's growth. We're all just trying to navigate the world we were given. And the best way to do that? Stop judging. Start learning. So drop your generation in the comments. And tell me one thing you think your generation got right. Not what you got wrong. What you got right. Because every generation has something valuable to teach. If you found this helpful, hit that subscribe button. We explore the depths of human psychology regularly here at The Thinking Brain. Like the video if it made you think differently. And I'll see you in the next one.